Okay, welcome back. This is Team TELUS. Emily, Abdul, Adam, Rebecca. And here is the challenge. How can provincial and federal governments ensure that telecommunications networks and infrastructure enable economy-wide reductions in GHG emissions? Another unimportant and easy policy challenge. So take it away, folks.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We would like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on lands that have long served as a place of meeting and exchange for Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We would like to thank and acknowledge the presence of the diverse Indigenous peoples who have graced this territory for centuries. Land recognitions are an important opportunity, not only to recognize peoples who have been guardians of the land for centuries, but also to recognize the contributions of the land itself. Planet Earth gives us many things, including a beautiful place to call home and all of the resources that we need to thrive. But planet Earth is threatened. In the last 70 years, we have entered a geological time period called the Anthropocene, where the activities of humans have fundamentally changed the Earth's environment and climate. Canada alone emits 700 megatons of greenhouse gas emissions every year. And while we have made commitments to reduce these emissions by 40% by the year 2030, in the last 5 years, we have only reduced our emissions by 2%. While this is a bleak picture, there are technologies and changes that provide hope, including changes in alternative energy sources, carbon capture and storage, as well as changes in our consumption patterns. But there is one avenue that has been neglected: the role of telecommunications equipment and technologies to reduce emissions. Our sponsor, TELUS, recognizes this potential. And today, our team, Abdul Hakim, Adam, Emily, and I will present our response to the question that they asked us 8 months ago. How can provincial and federal governments ensure that telecommunications networks and infrastructure enable economy-wide reductions in greenhouse gas emissions? We wanted to begin by understanding, because we were surprised by this question, what are the real opportunities? Several studies have shown that telecommunications could represent a reduction of 15 to 20% through the use of smart homes, smart transportation, and precision agriculture. If anyone has looked on Google Maps and seen a routing that has a little green leaf next to it, that's an example of how telecommunications can enable reductions in fuel usage. Convinced that there was a real opportunity, we wanted to understand what is the emissions of the telecommunications industry. If we're going to recommend an increase in adoption, if the telecommunications industry emits a large amount themselves, it wouldn't be helpful and it would represent a large drawback. We learned that the telecommunications industry represents only 1.4% of global emissions. So there's an opportunity with a minimal opportunity for reduced or increased emissions. Next, we looked at the state of telecommunications infrastructure in Canada. In a vast country, we wanted to understand, will most Canadians and businesses have access to these technologies? In 2016, the Canadian Radio and Telecommunications Commission defined internet as an essential service. High-speed internet is defined as 50/10 upload-download speeds. And it's projected that by 2026, 98% of Canadians will have access to high-speed internet. This level of service allows us to interact with telemedicine and use remote learning opportunities, engaging with the digital economy, which can be powered by telecommunications. Convinced that there were opportunities to reduce emissions and that the majority of Canadians would have access to these infrastructures, we wanted to understand which industries had the highest potential. We looked at 5 different areas: buildings, electricity, oil and gas, agriculture, and transportation together represent 82% of Canada's emissions. They also represent industries that have a high potential and existing technologies that would use telecommunications to reduce emissions. Through a literature review, we learned through academic reports, industry studies, as well as case studies of different jurisdictions, how these technologies are already being used. In addition, we spoke to a diverse group of stakeholders that are working in these industries to understand what are the opportunities and barriers for Canada. We also learned that the connection between telecommunications and emissions reduction is not intuitive. In fact, none of Canada's climate strategies use the word telecommunications or connectivity as a key leverage point. This is despite the fact that there are headline issues that allow telecommunications to play a role in emissions reduction. In Ontario, the Peak Perks program offers subsidies to citizens who install smart thermostats. These thermostats will reduce the need for electricity during peak electricity demand times, like the summer when there's a high air conditioning load required. In December, the Government of Canada committed to reducing methane emissions from the oil and gas industry. Remote sensors that are connected to data technologies that allow us to turn off problematic leaks quickly and respond to problems require telecommunications infrastructure. Farmers are using drone imagery as well as satellite images to monitor crop health, reducing the need for fertilizer and enabling us to increase the amount of food that we produce. Finally, Global News shared a study that working remotely allows us to reduce emissions by almost half compared to office goers. So everyone who's tuned in virtually, you are currently using telecommunications to reduce your carbon footprint. I'd now like to turn it over to Adam to speak to the barriers that have stopped us from implementing more of these technologies.
Thank you, Rebecca. Through our research, the team identified there are several barriers to the adoption of telecommunications technologies for both businesses and consumers. Direct barriers include specialized skills, price, and cybersecurity concerns. An indirect barrier we identified was regulatory uncertainty. Let's start by understanding the significant challenges that impede the widespread implementation of these technologies. Firstly, implementing telecommunications technologies to reduce emissions requires specialized skills and expertise. Businesses often need ICT professionals, data engineers, and environmental data scientists. Without this internal capacity, many businesses face resistance or delays in adopting these new technologies. For consumers, a lack of knowledge and comfort with new technologies poses a significant barrier. This gap highlights the need for greater education and support in this area. The second barrier we identified was price. Many of these technologies, such as digital twins, remote monitoring, and cloud computing, require substantial investment. Despite the long-term benefits of energy efficiency, the immediate financial costs deter many businesses. For consumers, particularly low-income Canadians, the price is a significant barrier. Nearly half of Canadians with an annual income of less than $30,000 did not have internet at home in 2019. However, there are positive developments, like the 26.6% decrease in consumer prices for cellular services in the past year, as reported by Statistics Canada. Another development includes the initiatives like the TELUS Connecting Families Initiative and programs from telecoms that provide low-cost internet access. The third barrier we identified was cybersecurity. Increased connectivity introduces vulnerabilities that cybercriminals can exploit. According to BlackBerry, nearly 2/3 of businesses see cybersecurity as a significant barrier to digital adoption. These concerns are echoed in the agriculture sector, where cyber attacks have targeted farmers' data. Individuals also worry about privacy, which can deter them from adopting smart home technologies. Addressing these cybersecurity concerns is crucial for fostering trust and encouraging adoption. I've chosen not to use smart home technology like an Amazon Echo Hub or Google Nest for exactly this reason, and this lack of trust is shared by 28 to 40% of Canadians according to Statistics Canada. An indirect barrier that our team identified was regulatory uncertainty and friction. Regulatory uncertainty can also impact the adoption and deployment of telecommunications infrastructure. The CRTC, which Rebecca previously defined, regulates the sector, aiming to balance innovation and consumer interests. However, regulatory instability creates challenges for providers, affecting their long-term investment decisions and the quality of services offered. Recent mandates require major companies to share fiber networks with competitors, and this has led to significant financial impacts, including job cuts and reduced investments. Additionally, unclear municipal right-of-way regulations further complicate infrastructure deployment, causing delays and increasing costs. Ultimately, addressing the barriers to adopting telecommunications technologies is essential for achieving a sustainable and low-carbon future for Canada. By overcoming challenges related to specialized skills, price, cybersecurity, and regulatory uncertainty, we can unlock the full potential of these telecommunications technologies to reduce emissions and drive economic benefits. Now, let's look into the decision-making principles that led to our team's recommendations. In developing recommendations to leverage telecommunications for emissions reduction, several criteria were considered. These were the potential for significant greenhouse gas reductions, ease of implementation, stakeholder buy-in, scalability, regulatory alignment, and economic viability. Based on these criteria, two main recommendations were selected. These were the Telecommunications Enabled Greenhouse Gas Reductions Partnership and the National Smart Grid Interoperability and Cooperation Framework. These initiatives focus on improving industry adoption due to higher greenhouse gas emissions from industrial applications. Abdul Hakim will now elaborate on our first recommendation.
So before I talk about our first recommendation, I want to give a brief context or background to why we came with the recommendation in the first place. So telecom technologies do exist to reduce companies' GHG emissions, optimize their operations, and make them less carbon intensive. For instance, it enables precision agriculture, which allows for soil monitoring, optimizes fertilizer applications, and reduces excess nitrate emissions. Again, it enables GPS tractors, which uses less fuel by following accurate and precise paths. Additionally, it also enables car sharing and carpooling platforms, which uses less fuel and optimizes vehicle use. These are just few examples of how telecom technologies can reduce GHG emissions, but have mostly been implemented in pilot phases. And to increase adoption and scale the rate of these technologies, additional support is needed. On the other hand, we have the industry who are looking for ways to reduce their carbon footprint, but most often lack the expertise and resources to do that. They need the insights and innovations from these telecom technology companies. And we have the government that sets the policies, provide the funding, and create this enabling environment where these collaborations can thrive. In line with this, we are recommending to the telecom industry, including TELUS, to advocate to the federal government to create a PPP, public-private partnership, that will dubbed Telecom-Enabled GHG Partnership, that will include the federal government, telecom industry, and the dependent industries. These PPP will be responsible for identifying places in the industry where telecom technologies can reduce GHG emissions, and once these projects are identified, either through industry analysis or application from businesses, they work with them to implement them at their business premises. So what does the governance structure look like? As you can see on the slide, we have the chairperson who will chair the board, and we have the governance board made up of 7 part-time members responsible for project selection, and we have the implementation arm made up of 20 to 50 full-time employees responsible for implementation. These people will implement 500 projects over the 5 years and to range across levels of businesses, including small, medium, and large businesses, etc. So what are the objectives of this PPP? It will accelerate the adoption of telecom technologies. Many businesses do not adopt these technologies because the resources are limited. But with this PPP in place, industries such as oil and gas, agriculture, transport, mining, buildings can benefit from the integration of these technologies. It is estimated that telecom technologies can reduce Canada's GHG emissions by 15% globally. Let me say that again. Telecom technologies can reduce Canada's GHG emissions, can reduce global emissions by 15% globally. This is more than 4 times the total number of emissions of Canada alone. So we are talking about something very huge, something very significant, and Canada ought to tap into this potential. It will also remove barriers for implementation. Many businesses face challenges when it comes to adopting these technologies, as Adam mentioned. So the cost of implementing these, or even getting the right people with the right mindset or the right expertise, is the difficulty. And with these PPP in place, it seeks to reduce these barriers, if not eliminate them all. Another objective of this PPP is the fact that it will create a collaborative environment where businesses, telecom industry, federal government can share knowledge and best practices on how to effectively reduce Canada's GHG emissions. The last objective, it will increase productivity. According to McKinsey and Company report, the global impact of IoT applications, the Internet of Things applications, ranges from $3.9 trillion to $11.1 trillion per year in 2025. This is more than 4 times the total GDP of Canada alone. So we are talking about something very huge, something very significant. And we recognize as a team that every project comes with this risk, and mitigating these risks are important for the success of the project. And with this, we have identified 2 main risks, which is low stakeholder buy-in and public awareness. With the lack of buy-in, stakeholders might be hesitant to adopt these technologies because of fear of operational disruptions. And this fear of the unknown can hinder their participation in these projects, and it might discourage them from participating in these technologies. Public awareness risk. Promoting these PPP is crucial for its success. If people, whether they are from the government, they are from the telecom industry, or they are from even the dependent industries, do not understand how these telecom technologies can reduce GHG emissions, or how they can even get involved in this project might not get the momentum and traction it needs to thrive. And we agree, these PPP cannot solve all GHG related problems. It uses telecom technologies to reduce GHG emissions. So we work with other partnerships to direct businesses that are better suited for other programs. And as you can see on the left-hand side of the board, we have the potential partner programs. We have the Agri-Innovation and Agriculture Clean Tech Fund, which are 2 departmental programs from the Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada that funds agriculture-related GHG emissions with emphasis on digitalization and clean tech. And we also have the Green Growth Hub, which is the gateway resources that fund green initiatives. As Adam mentioned, one of the things we looked when we were considering these PPP is the fact that it is affordable. So it uses only $29 million over the 5 years. And if implemented, it will reduce Canada's GHG emissions by 6%, which is equal to 40 megatons of reductions. So in sum, this PPP is affordable, cost-effective, implementable, achievable, and has the greatest potential of reducing Canada's GHG emissions. And I'll now give it to Emily to talk about our second recommendation on how telecom technologies can reduce GHG emissions. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdulhakeem. Continuing on from industry-level adoption, I'd like to take a step back. Electricity is a common thread across Canadian economic sectors. Its consumption is integral to meeting the needs of consumers, the industry, and government operations. As Canada ups its efforts to meet net zero targets, electricity demand is expected to increase by up to 2.1 times 2022 levels by 2050. And this is largely driven by the electrification of transportation and other essential services that were previously reliant on fossil fuels. However, the value of this transition is largely dependent on the source of the energy generation itself, whether it's from low-emission and renewable sources such as hydro, wind, and solar, or from high-emission fossil fuels such as coal and natural gas. And as a federation, Canada offers an even more complex challenge. Electricity-related emissions vary from province to province due to differences in the energy grid mix and resources. For example, 92% of Quebec's power is generated through very low-emitting hydropower. In contrast, 78% of Alberta's power comes from natural gas, and 22% of Saskatchewan's power comes from coal. And so while increased electrification is important to weaning Canada's dependency on fossil fuels, the source of that electricity will become increasingly important. And in this sense, smart grids offer a potential solution, leading to a potential emission reduction of up to 3.9%. Smart grids reduce emissions by coordinating electricity distribution across the grid, favoring low-emission renewable sources like wind and solar. These sources are variable, dependent on the sun rising and the wind blowing. They often need high-emission peaker power plants, such as coal fire, to supplement when electricity demand is high. By efficiently allocating electricity and connecting multiple smart grids increase the number of power sources available at any given time and reduce the need for peaker power plants to come online. And so what exactly makes a smart grid? Smart grids are enabled by telecommunications technology supporting the flow of information and control signals necessary for electricity management. IoT devices, or Internet of Things, such as smart meters, sensors, and controllers are deployed throughout the grid to collect data. This data encompasses information on consumption patterns and demand, grid conditions, and equipment performance. This data is then transmitted in real time across broadband networks, allowing utility companies to make data-based allocation decisions. And this value is being recognized across Canada. Natural Resource Canada's Green Infrastructure and Smart Grid program has allocated $100 million in funding towards utility companies for pilot and deployment projects of smart grids. And we also want to emphasize that smart grid upgrades make business sense for utility companies, optimizing electricity generation, preventing more expensive peaker power plants from coming online, and detecting electricity leakages through IoT sensors. And therefore, we recognize that the industry needs no further help in driving these upgrades forward. And so as we build more smart grids across Canada, it's important to have everybody working together. Our recommendation is that the telecommunications industry should advocate for a national smart grid, interoperability, and cooperation framework. Have you ever traveled internationally and finally arrived at your hotel ready to plug in your phone, only to find out that it didn't fit into the socket? This is an international failure of interoperability and something we want to avoid when it comes to smart grids. We need to agree on the same standards so grids can connect and talk to each other. But we also need utility companies to connect and talk to each other, both provincially and interprovincially. And all of this will help us create one national smart grid that works to reduce emissions and improve energy efficiency for the entire country. We have three main objectives behind this recommendation. First is to maximize emission reductions by enabling the efficient integration of renewable sources in demand-side electricity management strategies. Second is to amplify and standardize the use of telecommunications-enabled technologies to improve the efficiency of electricity systems. And third is to streamline cooperation among stakeholders, including governments, utility companies, and manufacturers. And to do this, we propose a three-phased approach. Phase 1 starts with developing interoperability standards. Unstandardized grids may connect differently across various vendors. This introduces challenges to integrating new technology with existing infrastructure. As projects roll out, it's important to set early standards to reduce the need to retrofit. Minimizing retrofitting is not only cost-effective, but much more environmentally friendly by preventing unnecessary e-waste. This phase will follow the standard-setting process of a national standard of Canada set by the Standards Council of Canada, or the SCC. The SCC will form a technical committee made up of experts and interested parties. The technical committee will then conduct research, draft standards, and open them for public feedback. Once the feedback is integrated at the discretion of the committee, the standards will be sent back to the SCC for approval and publishing. The second phase is about enabling interprovincial cooperation. This phase will create a national electricity market that benefits utility companies across Canada. The federal government will facilitate the signing of Memorandums of Understanding, or MOUs, between provinces, territories, and utility companies. This will establish a streamlined system for buying and selling electricity across Canada. This market will operate on free market principles, enabling utility companies to sell at competitive market rates. By establishing a national market, this initiative aims to remove potential barriers between jurisdictions and create a more unified approach to energy distribution in Canada. The federal government will develop a standardized agreement template to guide the process, ensuring consistency across the country. The final phase is through monitoring and enforcement. It puts the responsibility of ensuring compliance onto provincial energy regulators. This decentralized approach recognizes the different jurisdictional and regulatory needs across Canada. Further, in terms of continual evaluation, the interoperability standards will be renewed every 5 years to ensure that they're still effective and efficient. This is important because technology changes quickly, and we don't want the standards to hold the industry back or prevent new and better ways of doing things. This three-phased approach will ensure the framework is able to deliver on top-tier coordination that we know Canada is capable of, and to provide an efficient, low-emission smart grids to Canadians. But we recognize this approach is not without risks. The first risk we've identified is the potential for low stakeholder buy-in. Canadian utility companies face financial incentives to prioritize electricity exports to the US over interprovincial sales within Canada. Deals with the US can offer substantial revenues that are difficult to match in the Canadian market. For example, in 2021, Hydro-Quebec signed a $20 billion deal with the state of New York to supply clean electricity for the next 25 years. Therefore, it's important to encourage the participation of Canadian utility companies through these MOUs that ensure that electricity prices reflect the market conditions to enable competition. This approach would make interprovincial sales much more financially attractive. And if market rate electricity sales are not enough to enable the first bouts of competition, the federal government can also consider introducing an incentive of a 2% bonus to sellers for the first 10 years of this program. The second risk is the potential for lagging standards. If the development process is too long, there is a risk that the standards development may lag behind the rate of rapid technological advancement. To prevent this from occurring, we propose two solutions. First, the standards development process should not exceed 1 year. This allows standards to better reflect the current technology for smart grids and keep pace with innovation. Second, the technical committee should consider smart grid infrastructure already installed in Canada in the standards development process, and they should choose a standard that leads to minimal retrofitting as discussed earlier. This ensures the standards are an accurate and achievable goal for Canadian infrastructure. And so given the low risk, the final aspect to consider is cost. Through a bottom-up, activities-based cost analysis, the total cost estimate for 10 years of this recommendation is projected to be $1.1 million. And so overall, this program is cost-effective, achievable, and has the potential to reduce emissions by up to 3.9%. And now I'll hand it over to Rebecca, who will deliver our closing remarks and summarize the key takeaways from today's presentation.
In conclusion, our team is excited to present these two recommendations about how telecommunications can reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. The Telecommunications Enabled Greenhouse Gas Reductions Partnership is a public-private partnership that uses funds and expertise brought together from the government and telecommunications companies and investments from companies to execute 500 projects over 5 years. It would represent a reduction of 6% in our emissions and an investment of $29 million. The Smart Grid Interoperability and Cooperation Framework would allow Canada's smart grid to become a national smart grid that speaks and communicates with itself, as well as developing MOUs between provinces to streamline the sale of renewable energy across provincial borders. This would represent a reduction of 3.9% in greenhouse gas emissions and an investment of $1.1 million. The total is less than the City of Montreal spends on snow clearing every year. We recognize that the connection between telecommunications and emissions reduction is not intuitive. But over the last 8 months, we have learned that it is an opportunity for a multi-sectoral approach to climate solution and emissions reduction. We'd like to close by thanking our sponsor, Joe, and our coach, Ian Scott, who have both been incredibly valuable in developing these recommendations. Thank you for your attention today, and we look forward to your questions.
2 minutes to go. You can bank that and use it later. Okay, team of judges. Who would like to start? Shaq.
Thanks for that. That was a great presentation. My question is on the interprovincial cooperation. I think we've seen a few presentations today where we just kind of gloss over and make it seem very easy to cooperate between levels of government, but in reality, it doesn't really work like that. So maybe I missed it when you spoke on it, but I'm just curious, why would the provinces agree to kind of cede jurisdiction to the federal government to coordinate on this, to move forward on a smart grid technology? I think it's recommendation number 2. If you can kind of explain that a bit further, because I think just saying an MOU is, maybe it's not as easy as we kind of think it is.
Sure, thank you for your question. In terms of when we were developing how we wanted to go about offering a national smart grid, we definitely came at it with this approach of electricity generation, and all surrounding that is provincial jurisdiction. So what can be the role of the federal government? And the way that we view them is this almost unifying approach. The framework itself is not meant to, it's an entirely voluntary approach. The goal is to create these like standards across Canada. So if we go through our phases, the first phase has more federal kind of intervention and guidance, because creating a national standard is in a federal pool. But as we go through the different phases, the power gets transferred more and more to the provinces. And that middle phase in those MOUs that you've highlighted, of the question of why would they want to cooperate, we feel that signing on to a national smart grid, there are many different energy resources across Canada, and as different provinces try to reduce their emissions in their electricity grids, it's entirely dependent on the resources that province has. For example, Quebec is able to rely very heavily on hydropower because they have that resource, whereas Alberta and Saskatchewan don't. And so how are we able to rebalance these skills? And the way that we would present it to a provincial government would be, not only are you able to reduce emissions in your own electricity grid, but this also presents cost savings for utility companies involved, which then trickle down to consumers, because peaker power plants tend to be a lot more expensive to run than more renewable sources like wind, solar, hydro. And so the way that we in our minds are phrasing it is, not only this is good cooperation to reduce emissions, but it's also good cooperation for consumers. And so on a provincial level, we think that's the way that we would frame it towards them.
Great presentation, thank you. Again, a little, gotta confess, I'm actually on the board of TELUS. But I promise that has no effect on any of my views of this. But I really appreciate this. I mean, I do fundamentally, the telecom industry, without question, has a role to play. That's pretty exciting. I appreciate your ambition about the interoperability across the different provinces. There's a tremendous amount of work that's been done on trying to figure out why that doesn't happen. And it's really complicated, but, appreciate the ambition. My question on that would be a little bit on, do you have to have interprovincial interoperability to benefit from smart grid technologies, right? That can be province by province. That's more of a comment. My question, though, is on the financials. Did you do an analysis, whether it be in partnership with others or the telcos themselves? Are there opportunities for carbon credits based on the emissions that the telcos are able to facilitate? So it's a pretty straight, it's an economic question more than anything else, but just curious if you'd done that.
I love this question. It's not something that we looked at specifically. There was a program that looked at increasing the adoption of smart grids across Canada that came out of NRCan. And so there's pilot projects that have already started in a variety of cities. What we're looking at is, how do we move from the early adoption phase into a more widespread adoption? And I think that this could be an avenue that could use that. We didn't look at it specifically, but I'd be curious to learn more.
Okay, while we're in true confessions, I was Deputy Minister of Energy in BC for several years. So, of course, I'm dying to talk about the smart grid some more, but maybe we can do that after. I should make myself turn the page. So let me do that and talk about the partnership proposal. I guess a question and a comment. So my comment is that pretty well every example I can think of where we've set up, and we being the Canadian population, has set up this kind of partnership arrangement. It takes forever to get up and running. So I'm thinking of the 5 superclusters that took a couple of years to kind of get going. The infrastructure bank, I think we're 4 years in and barely even going. And so I'm wondering about your thoughts about how you could actually get something up and running quickly when you've got kind of you're promising a 5-year time horizon to get up and running and achieve things. So that's kind of a comment that a lot easier said than done to actually hit the ground running. But I'm also a bit confused about how you hit the ground running. You've got 500 projects that are going to get going, and your budget, I think, is for the staff who run this model. So where does the money come from for those 500 projects?
So with the first question about how to get things running. So basically, this is has benefits for all industry players. For the telecom industry, they will benefit from the increased usage of their services. So basically, it is a financial benefit for them. They will get more exposure. They get more money from it. From the industry, they will benefit from operating on a clean environment. And for the federal government, it will feed into their climate energy goals. So how to get this running? This is an implementation forecast program, right? So, and we have spoken to ISED, we have spoken to the telecom industry, and we have spoken to the federal government, and they are willing and want to participate in this program. So basically, and every sector has kind of shown their interest in doing this, because this is a very innovative program, where people don't understand how telecom technologies can reduce GHG emissions, right? So if we are bringing this, all of them are very interested. So coming to the financials, right? It will be funded by the spectrum monies, right? These monies come from the telecom industry. So if you are using these monies kind of spent on them to clean the economy, to reduce GHG emissions, it is well placed. So basically, yeah, it will come from the spectrum monies, and it will use to fund the clean initiatives and the greenhouse gases practices. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. I'd like to ask a related question. I mean, obviously, Canada's had rather a mixed history of some of these initiatives. I mean, the technology clusters and various other sort of attempts to kind of kickstart innovation and get some of these things to change. And wonder to what extent you've kind of in the course of doing this, you've studied some of the examples of these kinds of efforts, and you know, to the extent that it's possible to sort of draw lessons of sort of what works, what doesn't, and how much of that is reflected in your in your proposal here for the technology-enabled GHG reductions partnership.
Sure, thanks for the question. When we were coming with the recommendations, we looked at several case studies. Even in Canada here, we have the Green Municipal Fund, which is being operated by the Canadian municipalities, right? And it has actually been very successful. It has decreased GHG emissions by 2.87 million tons of GHGs. It has contributed 1.2 billion to the national GDP. That is just in Canada alone. And international best practices, we have the one in the US called the Transportation Electrification Partnership, which is being launched by the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator to reduce GHG emissions. And this has a potential of reducing US emissions by 20%. So yeah, they're having international practices in this regard, and they have been very hugely successful. Yeah. Thank
you. Okay. Sponsors. We have one online. One online? Okay.
Oh, okay. Our sponsor.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Okay,
great. Hi, I'm Joe from TELUS, and I had the great privilege of being the sponsor for this project. So before I ask a quick question, I'd like to say congratulations to Rebecca and Emily and Abdul and Adam for an excellent product, which we've all witnessed the outcome of their work today, but more so in terms of the process that they followed and the kind of environment they created when we would have opportunities to get together and talk through these ideas. So, congratulations to the team on a real wonderful product. And I definitely appreciate the questions from the judges, especially the question from the TELUS board member. So that's great that everyone is kind of plugged into this. And the last thing I'll say is that one of the points that was made right at the beginning of the presentation was that it's not intuitive that telecom is critical to fighting climate change. And I think this report goes a long way in remedying that. So great to see telecom positioned in that way. So My question, I think, is pretty short here. I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about the assumptions and the calculations that went into your climate projections, as these are very substantial, meaningful reductions in GHG emissions of 6% and almost 4%. So if you could say a little bit more about that, that would be great. Thank you.
Excellent. So we looked at, for the PPP, the projection over 5 years and said, what would be a reasonable and conservative estimate based on that 15% number? From that, we said, all right, can we use a small portion of that 15% and take 10 megatons per year with 125 projects? The reason I'm saying 125 is we had that 500 number. We said we're probably only going to have 4 years of real implementation time. It takes 6 months to get going. You've got 4 months or 4 years of work, and then you've got a 6-month wind down time. So that gives you 125 projects a year, which was also how we determined the staffing number. Doing a cumulative, we get to 40 megatons over the 5 years, which is a 6% reduction versus our current emissions. The 3.9 comes from an estimate in an academic paper looking at how smart grids have a potential to reduce emissions. This is a fairly conservative estimate. Not only was the study done several years ago, but it talks about what is the emissions reduction potential for the electricity grid. Not only the impact that that electricity grid can have to making Canada's energy transition possible, as well as all of the things that are dependent on electricity. So that's where those two numbers come from.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for that.
Is there a follow-up question from the sponsor?
It's not a follow-up. Maybe it's a separate question.
Okay.
I am curious, now that you've done this work and you have, two great ideas, what are your next steps?
There will probably be a celebration phase. Also, in 2 weeks, we're presenting this work to ICED just to share the recommendations and hear their feedback as well. I think we've also discussed as a team other communication strategies, including doing a bit more promotion of the work and the possibility behind telecommunications to reduce emissions.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to others. I've got a hand up from Ian Scott and then Neil. Ian, take it away.
Thank you, and congratulations. Great job on the presentation and the project. It's been a pleasure to work with you. Question I have for you is perhaps you can comment a little more about the digital divide in rural areas. Obviously, you quoted the statistic, the government's on target to have broadband reach the vast majority of Canadians, but it's still a challenge in the most remote areas, but we didn't talk a lot about it. So I wonder if you could just touch on that, please.
Sure. Thank you. So when we started looking at different areas where telecom technologies can make a significant impact, we initially started looking at the different industries and their emission levels. And then we looked at specific industries, what possibilities within those does telecom play. And so when we were developing our recommendations, we were really looking for total impact. And as part of our policy challenge, there was a section about improving the digital divide and rural and remote access to telecom technologies. But as we continued on in our research, we kind of came to the conclusion that while there is a prevalent digital divide that exists in rural, remote, and particularly Indigenous communities, in terms of a total impact strategy, which is what we've used to develop our recommendations, given the low numbers of people residing in these communities compared to the rest of Canada, we've decided to go on a more impact-driven basis. That being said, we do believe that there are significant opportunities in these regions. The reason we kind of ended up going down this electricity path started looking at small modular reactors and how those can help communities transition off of diesel power. So there are opportunities to employ these, but in terms of total impact, the reason we've gone with these particular recommendations is because of the broader appeal.
Great presentation. I have a question about smart grid and interoperability along the east-west side, and it's because one of the regulators that wasn't mentioned is the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission of the U.S., which regulates standards, including in Canada, across north-south bands. So where it comes to smart grid regulation or interoperability, I'm just wondering if you had any thinking about where the US is at and where the FERC might be at, and what is the relationship between your proposals and the US electricity regulator?
Thank you for that question. As part of our research in looking at smart grid examples and framework examples, the US did show up in our research. That particular example did not come up in our research, but we did identify in the United States there is the National Institute of Standards and Tech Framework and Roadmap. In terms of being implemented, there's still much work to be done. And in terms of examples, we identified other countries like Australia, but that specific example did not show up in our initial research.
Okay, other questions? If nobody else asks a question, then I'm going to have to ask one. So my question is connected to Ian's question about rural connectivity. And I'm wondering if there is if you'd thought at all about a scope for a policy twofer. And I wonder if, given the housing crisis that we appear to be in, with very quickly rising house prices, especially in big cities, whether an improvement in rural connectivity could actually help to deal with the housing issue, but also assuming that people could work from those rural or less big city homes remotely with better broadband, you could also have the GHG reduction. So do you think about that? Is that, as I'm sure it's not as easy as I just suggested, does it actually even add up in the way I suggested?
It was something that we thought about, not necessarily with the housing lens, but we did think about remote work. What does telecommunications enable? And I think the reason that we kind of strayed away from that is we're also seeing from corporations post-COVID, there's a cultural desire to have people in the office. We saw from the federal government asking people to come into the office 3 days a week. We're seeing from corporations that there's a real desire for that. So I think if we went down that road, there would be a secondary road of corporate culture that we would have to have a conversation about. In talking with our stakeholders, we absolutely heard that higher connectivity allows people to be in more remote locations. Whether that's remote learning, whether that's telemedicine, people don't move to communities where they can't get connection. Even within our team, we had conversations about cottages that weren't connected and whether we could do remote learning during COVID. And so even in that small way, it's something that we thought about.
I just also have to add something after Shaq Chambers' question about interoperability and cooperation between provinces. Sounds like such a great idea, and it seems to be so difficult. I was in Manitoba last week, and I had conversations with the new finance minister and the premier's chief of staff. And Manitoba Hydro, which is almost 100% hydro and clean power, they claim that they have no incentive, zero financial incentive to build east-west interties, and which is shocking when you think about it, right? If Saskatchewan, as you pointed out, has 22% of their power that is from burning coal, if Saskatchewan wanted cleaner power, and cleaner power that is probably cheaper than what they've got, there is a way to do it. But in Manitoba, they perceive zero financial incentive. So it means that the feds probably will have to hold out more than just an MOU template. They may have to hold out, and in a classic Canadian tradition, financial, let's call them bribes, bribes to generate, behavior that is perceived to be in the national interest coming from the provinces. So I don't know if you've got any comment on that, but that's... I just want to share that with you.
Thank you. In terms of how to incentivize this, one thing that we've considered is a 2% bonus for the first 10 years of this framework to get these initial agreements signed and get the kind of get the wheels moving on the program. In terms of the financial incentives to sign on, specifically for something like hydropower, which is not something that you turn on, it's something that's continuously generating. In Quebec is a good example of where they have so much excess that they're able to sell to the US. And so if the Manitoba government or the Manitoba utility company, they have all this continual hydro generation, there is excess ability to sell it elsewhere as opposed to it kind of dissipating, because if it's not stored in batteries, it's not going anywhere. And so initially we recommend this 2% bonus for the first 10 years to kind of grease the wheels and moving, but we do also believe that this smart grid, having a more national smart grid where we're able to sell across our provincial borders, does have financial incentives because you're able to generate cleaner and cheaper energy, which does trickle down to consumers as well.
Okay. On that note, let's bring this to an end a little bit early, but nothing wrong with a slightly longer break. So thank you very much, folks. Great job.